Okay, so it's the first day of Watches and Wonders. Lots of new watches coming out from lots and lots of brands. But you know what? I'm going to go back in time for this video today. And here, now, on the first day of Watches and Wonders, I'm going to do a hot take on some Breitlings that were released a week or so ago. A bunch of Toptimes and Premiers. If that's got any interest for you, see me after the intro and we'll get into it.
Last clear, 7, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Pete McConville. Welcome to my channel where I overthink, overanalyze, and just generally get way too geeky about watches. What I'm going to geek out over today are some Breitlings that came out a week or so ago, a bunch of Toptimes and Premiers. These are interesting watches in that they kind of illustrate where Breitling is going and also where Breitling think the market is going. And because these watches are very similar and they do similar sorts of things, I'm going to sort of talk about them all at once, only occasionally picking out the differences between the two. So in 25 words or less, what has Breitling done here? The first thing with the Toptimes is that they've taken what was originally a kind of experimental capsule collection. A capsule collection in Breitling speak is something that they're trying out. It's a limited time production. In this case, these watches were released in September 2021 and have already been replaced, if you like. However, they've been very much upgraded in that time, and clearly Breitling have figured out that the watches are popular, but there are some things they can do to make them better. They've done something similar with the Premier line. What they've done here is replaced a bunch of more modern looking 42mm automatic chronographs with more automatic 42mm chronographs that have clearly borrowed very heavily, or actually they essentially replicate the 1930s and 40s look of the existing 40mm manual wind heritage chronograph. So an interesting thing going on here where it's kind of a replacement for the 42s, kind of a line extension for the 40s at the same time. And like I said, these changes are interesting because George Kern, the CEO of Breitling, has always made a big deal over the fact that they very much listen to customers, but they in doing so, they listen to actual real customers in store, and they don't really listen very much to, or they treat what they hear in social media and online from keyboard warriors with much more of a grain of salt. And you really do see that here with the kinds of changes that are being made. Some are the sorts of things that we watch geeks do get all excited about, but some, like the sizing, I think show a difference between what the real world actually wants and what we very small but vocal watch enthusiasts say we want, but I suspect often don't actually spend money on. So here are some of the changes that Breitling have made from the old to the new watches. The first is now all of these watches are entirely in-house. All the Toptime and all the Premier lines, I believe, are now completely in-house using Breitling in-house movements. Now, the Premiers, by and large, already were. However, what you had with the previous Toptimes is that they relied entirely upon ETA 2892A2 movements with a Dupree-Dupois chronograph module over the top. That's all gone now. These watches are all 100% in-house Breitling movements. Snap-on casebacks have all gone away, as has anything less than 100 meters water resistance. Everything's now a screw caseback. Most of them are display casebacks, and everything comes with 100 meters water resistance. I think it's interesting that all these watches are automatics. Yes, the Toptimes already were, as were the 42mm chronographs that have been replaced, but the heritage line, which goes back to these 1940s cues, had been predominantly manual wind. Now it's very clear that Breitling is happy to keep that styling, but they very much want to bring you more modern automatic movements. For both the Premiers and the Toptimes, Breitling clearly think that the proper size for a nice, easy to wear chronograph is somewhere in the 41 to 42 millimeter range. The Premiers, as I said before, slightly bigger than the manual wind look that they've carried on. Same size as the 42 millimeters that they've replaced. So they're 42 millimeters. The Toptimes have actually come down a little bit. The originals capsule collection were 42 millimeters. These are now 41 millimeters. Clearly, they're just playing a little bit with what looks the best in terms of like with the different light dial layouts and so forth. So they're not the same case. They're not being lazy. They're totally different cases, totally different dial shapes. The fifth thing I would say, and this is common with a number of Breitling watches that have come out recently, these watches are thin. We saw it with the earlier Super Oceans, where Breitling very much jumped on the whole Jean-Claude Beaver idea of thin is luxury, and they've taken this idea further and brought it out with these new watches. Automatic chronographs less than 14 millimeters thick are unusual. There's not a lot of them, and they tend to be very expensive. In this case, we've got the Toptimes are only 13.3 millimeters, and which is over a millimeter thinner than the ones that they replaced, the previous capsule collection. The Auto Premiers are just 13.6 millimeters thick, which is less than half a millimeter thicker than the manual wind. Clearly, Breitling's been doing some work on that B0 movement, making it a bit thinner over the last year or two. The last thing I'd point out here is that nothing screws down. There are no screw down pushes. There are no screw down crowns on this. These watches are designed to be pretty easy to live with. So if I had to sum up what Breitling's trying to do here, first off, I think they're trying to make something that is very Breitling. They're trying to really reinforce that Breitling is able to make everything in-house. They're trying to reinforce very Breitling history, very Breitling styling cues. I think they're also trying to make it really emphasize that these are very easy to own, to wear, to operate tools. Everything's pretty simple. Everything's pretty robust. You don't have to fiddle with any screw down crowns or screw down pushes. Finally, in both designs, certainly the Toptimes, they're really leaning into the casual, fun, easy to get along with vibe. But even the more formal heritage inspired chronos going back to the 40s are still kind of a little light-hearted. They're not heavy, they're not ponderous. Even though we've got slightly more muted colors, those are put against high polish. There's nothing fauxtina, there's nothing muted in any of the indices or any of the lume. Everything's really high, sort of high polish and a little bit sparkly and young, even in the more heritage-inspired watches. Okay, so if that's what Breitling's trying to do I reckon it worked? By and large, I think it has worked. I think these watches do achieve what it is that Breitling's out to get to. First off, they're very Breitling. The styling of the Toptimes, whilst different to the earlier Sprint and Toptime collections of the 60s and 70s, certainly do capture and carry forward the spirit of those more youthful designs from back then. Likewise, the heritage chronograph very much picks up and runs with a very Breitling look from back in the 40s. You know, both of these watches have clear stylistic ties to very Breitling looks. This goes further with Breitling is very much into using mesh and what they call their professional slanted link bracelets. Both of those feature heavily on these types. And then finally, obviously, moving to the all in-house movements, again, reinforces. These are very much Breitling watches. Also, these watches are really easy. 41 to 42 millimeters is a dead easy size of chronograph to wear and to use. Fraction bigger than a Daytona, but then on the other hand, Daytonas are notoriously difficult to read. Same size as a JLC Polaris, which is a kind of akin to the sort of feel both of these watches are giving off. And I think 42 and 41 millimeters is around the sweet spot for a chronograph. Not too big that it's hard to wear, not too small that it's hard to read. Nice Goldilocks position. But also across the board, just the sort of the way these watches have been built and spec'd really does reinforce that these are just easy watches to own. 100 meters water resistance across the board, so fairly trouble free. You can live your life with these watches pretty easily. But then on the other hand, they've been done such that you don't have to screw the crowns down or the pushers down to get that water resistance. There's no piss farting around, no fiddly little bits. All the watches are thin, all the watches are light, all the watches come with a variety of color choices and band choices and bracelet choices. Really, all the watches are priced within a couple of $100 of each other. There's not a lot of trade-offs you need to make here. There's not a lot of detailed analysis you need to do to choose the watch that's going to work for you. It's really quite simple. Pick the one you like the most, buy it, wear it. Very easy, very casual, very fun. It's exactly what Breitling's aiming for. Not just with these watches, really with all of their watches. I have kind of touched on this before, that these watches, certainly the new Heritage, do replace the older 42mm Premier chronographs. But there's more going on here. I think it's important to note that at the same time these watches came in, a whole swathe of other watches left. As I said before, the earlier 42s left, but also all the three-hander and day-date premiers are now gone. Those watches all relied upon ETA and Solita movements. A few more of the 7750 powered chronographs from a variety of collections have slowly vanished as well. There are now no ETA de Prix de Poix module-based chronographs left in the lineup at all. All those variants are gone. And what I would say is that a couple of weeks ago on Scottish Watches, George Kern announced, basically said, they are working on an in-house three-hander movement. That movement will be out in 2024. Take that. Look at the three-hander watches that they're getting rid of. Look at the way every new chronograph that's coming out is coming out with an in-house movement. And I think what we're going to see is those Solita and ETA-based movements slowly but surely continuing to vanish. And at this rate, by 2025, Breitling will be 100% absolutely in-house and will be competing directly with Rolex and Omega in every single way. Okay, so wrap this up. My thoughts. Well, personally, I'm a big fan of the direction that Breitling has taken. I've said that many, many times. Their idea of casual, easy, aesthetic, accessible, sustainable, all those woke words, they are me. That's how I like to live my life. That's how I like to see the world. So their corporate vision and what they're turning that into in watches very much is the kind of vibe I'm into, and it's the watches I want to buy. So therefore, that they've continued to do that with these watches makes them winners in my case. I must admit, I've always loved that pistachio green 40mm chronograph, the heritage-inspired one they've had before. I've gone down to my local AD and tried it on no less than a dozen times, but I've never bought it. And one of the reasons why is, frankly, it was always a little small. These new ones at 42mm look pretty good to me. I've also, and maybe I'm going to end up buying one. On the other hand, I always kind of liked the old Toptimes as well, but they were a bit thick, a bit chunky, and also coming from a chronograph specialist, a company which kind of gave us the modern chronograph. Even though I'm generally ambivalent about the whole in-house thing, I did kind of miss the idea that a Breitling chronograph wouldn't be in-house. And so that sort of stood in the way of me and the old Toptimes. So now we've got the Toptimes, which are fun and funky and easy and light and thinner and with an in-house movement. So maybe that's where some money will go. You know what? I don't know. Don't hold me to buying either of them. But I think there's a decent chance I'll have one probably within a year or two, which is probably the best sign of saying, yeah, I really like these collections. What about you? Hate them? Love them? think they're cheap and lazy imitations of work they've already done before, or sensible line extensions that reflect where the market is going and what's clearly working for Rolex, what's clearly working for Breitling. Let me know in the comments below. I've been Pete McConville. If you liked this, like, subscribe, do all that sort of thing. If you didn't like it, unlike the hell out of it, because that's still good for me. I'll see you later. Bye.